The letter was from a law office in a city 3 hours away. It was formal and spare, written in the language lawyers use when they want to communicate information without communicating enthusiasm. The property, it stated, consisted of approximately 4 acres of land in a rural area outside of town called Mira Seca. It included the remains of a stone structure, described with notable bureaucratic restraint as partially collapsed and uninhabitable in its current condition, as well as outbuildings of indeterminate structural integrity, and whatever else remained on the land after years of abandonment. There were no liens. There were no debts attached to the property. There was, the letter made clear, also no assessed value worth reporting. The estate had passed to Elena because she was the last living relative willing to accept it. 2 cousins had already declined in writing. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. Then she carried her bread to her car, sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes without starting the engine, and stared at the steering wheel. The heater was broken. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. Outside, the parking lot filled and emptied in its ordinary afternoon rhythm. People loading groceries, children pulling at sleeves, carts rattling over cracked asphalt. The world continued exactly as it had before the letter arrived. Elena was 38 years old. She had 2 children, Marco, who was 11, and Sophia, who was 8, and she had been raising them alone for 4 years. Since their father left for reasons he spent a long time explaining, and she spent a long time trying to believe. She worked 32 hours a week at the grocery store, took on cleaning work on weekends when she could find it, and covered the gaps with calculations so precise and habitual that they no longer felt like stress. They felt like weather, a permanent condition she had learned to dress for. She was not a bitter person. That was important to understand about her. She did not move through her days with resentment or self-pity or the sharp edge that poverty sometimes carves into people who have carried it too long. She moved through them with the particular economy of someone who has learned that energy is a resource like any other and must not be wasted. She laughed at things that were genuinely funny. She cooked well with almost nothing. She read to her children every night. She was in every observable sense managing, but managing was not the same as living, and she knew the difference, even if she rarely let herself sit with it long enough to feel it fully. The apartment she rented was on the 2nd floor of a building that had been cheaply constructed in the 70s and maintained, since then, with the minimum effort required to avoid formal complaints. The radiator in the hallway made sounds at night that both children had named and assigned personalities to. The window in the kitchen let in cold air through a gap that the landlord had sealed twice with foam that compressed and failed within weeks each time. She had sealed it herself the 3rd time, with strips of an old towel and clear tape, and it had held through the winter. Small victories accumulated like that, quiet and unwitnessed, building a life that was functional without being comfortable. The letter sat in her apron pocket for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about it while she stocked shelves, while she ate her break lunch standing at the back counter, while she drove to pick up Marco from school and Sophia from her after-school program. At dinner, she mentioned it to them the way she mentioned most things, plainly, without drama, because she had found that children absorb the emotional register of information more than the information itself, and she did not want to hand them either false hope or unnecessary worry. "Your great-great-uncle Teodoro died," she said. "He left us some land." Marco looked up from his food. "What kind of land?" "Old land, with an old building on it." "Is it a house?" "Part of one. The rest fell down." Sophia considered this with the focused expression she brought to puzzles. "Can we go see it?" "Maybe," Elena said. "I have to think about it first." After the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a letter and her laptop and looked up what she could about the property. The address corresponded to a location that appeared on satellite maps as a dark patch of overgrown terrain bordered by a narrow road and open fields. She could make out the vague shape of a structure, stone walls visible from above as a rough outline, like the sketch of a house rather than a house itself. The surrounding land was dense with vegetation that had grown in over years without management. There were no neighboring structures visible within easy distance. The nearest town was 7 kilometers away. She looked at it for a long time, zooming in and out, trying to extract information from an image that offered very little. Then she closed the laptop, finished her tea, and went to bed. She did not tell anyone else about the inheritance for almost 2 weeks. When she finally mentioned it to her sister Carmen, it was during a phone call that had started about something else entirely. Carmen lived in a larger city, worked in hospital administration, had a husband and a mortgage and opinions that arrived pre-formed and were delivered with the confidence of someone who had never needed to revise them. Elena told her about the letter matter-of-factly, the same way she had told Marco and Sophia. Carmen's response was immediate. Don't do anything with it. I haven't done anything with it. I mean, don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't. Properties like that are money traps. You'd have to pay taxes on it, maintain it, deal with whatever problems it has. You work at a grocery store, Elena. You don't have the resources for a property. I know what I have, Elena said quietly. I'm just being realistic. I know. There was a pause. Then Carmen said, more gently, what did the lawyer say it was worth? He didn't say it was worth anything. Right. So it's rubble. Inherited rubble. The kindest thing to do is sign it back over to the county or sell it for whatever someone will give you. Elena thanked her and changed the subject, and they talked about other things for another 10 minutes. And when she hung up, she sat for a moment in the quiet apartment with the radiator making its personality noises in the hall and thought about the word her sister had used. Rubble. It landed with the particular weight of a word chosen not to describe a thing, but to end a conversation about it. She did not follow Carmen's advice. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday, when she had arranged for the children to stay with a neighbor she trusted, she drove the 3 hours to Mira Seca and saw the property for the first time. The road that led to it began as pavement and narrowed gradually into something less certain. Cracked, then graveled, then a track of compressed earth marked by old tire grooves, and bordered on both sides by grasses and low shrubs that pressed in close enough to brush the sides of her car. She drove slowly, watching for the landmarks the lawyer's directions had described, and found the entrance marked by nothing more than a gap in the vegetation and a rusted iron post that might once have held a gate. She parked and walked in. The property announced itself honestly. There was no attempt at impression, no feature designed to flatter. The stone walls she had seen from above on the satellite image were exactly that. Walls, some still standing to a height of 2 meters, others collapsed to knee height or lower, their stones scattered across the ground in patterns that suggested which sections had failed first. The structure was large. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had imagined something modest, a small rural outbuilding grown legendary through family silence. What she found instead was the bones of something considerable. The footprint of the original building covered a space she paced out at roughly 40 meters by 20, a sprawling single-story structure with what appeared to have been several distinct interior sections, their divisions still traceable in the surviving wall fragments. The stone itself was remarkable. Heavy, dark, cut with an intention that spoke of craftsmanship rather than convenience. Some pieces were so large she could not imagine how they had been moved without machinery. They lay where they had fallen, undisturbed, exactly as gravity had arranged them. There had been no salvage operation, no one coming to collect the stone for other uses. Everything that had ever been here was still here. It had just been rearranged by time. She walked the perimeter slowly, stepping over fallen sections, testing the ground with each foot before trusting it. The soil was uneven, soft in some places where vegetation had taken over, firm in others where stone lay just beneath the surface. Old trees had grown up inside the walls in the decades since the roof collapsed, their roots working between the stones with patient, vegetable persistence. Vines covered the eastern wall completely, the growth so dense and established it had become structural, holding stones together that would otherwise have slid apart. She found the original entrance on the south side, a doorway whose arch had partially survived, 2 massive upright stones still standing with a third resting across them at an angle, held there by nothing more than the precision of its own weight. She stood beneath it and looked in. The interior was open sky now. The floor was earth and stone and decades of fallen leaves. A young tree grew near what would have been the center of the space, its trunk already thick enough that it had clearly been there for many years. She stood there for a long time, letting the place exist around her the way it was, without imposing any version of what it might become. The outbuildings were in varying states. 1. A low stone structure to the north of the main building had lost its roof but kept its walls almost entirely. Another, smaller and set apart from the others, had collapsed so completely that only the outline of its foundation remained, a shallow rectangle in the earth. A third structure, partially obscured by overgrowth, revealed itself as she pushed through the brush. A storage building of some kind, its walls still largely intact, its interior dark and dry, its roof made of old timber that had somehow held. She stepped inside carefully, letting her eyes adjust. The air inside was cool and still. It smelled of old wood and earth, a smell that she associated not with decay, but with preservation, the smell of things left alone long enough to stabilize. The floor was hard-packed earth. Along one wall, crude wooden shelves had been built at some point and still stood, their boards bowed but unbroken. A few old glass bottles stood on the bottom shelf, their contents long since evaporated or absorbed. Tools hung from iron hooks, a scythe, its blade rusted but its handle still solid, and several implements she could not immediately identify. Everything was covered in a layer of dust, so fine, and even it looked like fabric. She touched the shelf. It held. She pressed her weight against the nearest wall. It did not move. She stayed on the property for 4 hours that first day, moving slowly, observing without judgment. She took photographs, hundreds of them, methodically covering every section of every wall, every fallen stone arrangement, every corner of every surviving structure. She photographed the ground, the tree growth, the way certain sections of wall had failed differently from others. She was not a builder. She was not an architect or an engineer or anyone with formal training in structures. But she understood the difference between things that had failed and things that were failing, between past damage and present danger. The main ruin was the former. The outbuildings, particularly the intact storage structure, were somewhere between the two, worn but not defeated. Before she left, she walked back to the main ruins and stood in the center of what had once been a room. The sky above her was gray and even. The young tree beside her moved slightly in a wind she could not feel from inside the walls. The stones around her were cold and old and indifferent in the way that old things become indifferent, having simply outlasted enough human drama to stop responding to it. She thought about the 2 cousins who had signed the refusal letters. She thought about Carmen's voice on the phone, clipped and certain. Inherited rubble. She thought about the lawyer's letter describing the structure as uninhabitable in its current condition, which was true and had no doubt been written as a warning, but which had struck her when she first read it, and struck her again now, standing inside the ruin, as also a description of something that had a current condition, something that existed, that had not dissolved or disappeared, that was still there to be dealt with, one way or another. She drove home. She picked up the children. She made dinner. She did not say anything that night about what she had seen, but she had already made up her mind. The decision did not arrive the way decisions do in stories, as a bolt of clarity, a moment of cinematic resolution. It arrived the way most real decisions do, gradually, in the spaces between other things, accumulating through small acts of commitment, until one day she realized that the question of whether she would do this had been quietly replaced by the question of how. She requested 2 weeks of unpaid leave from the grocery store, citing a family matter, which was accurate enough. She arranged for Marco and Sophia to stay with their neighbor Dolores, a retired woman 3 doors down who loved them with the unsentimental affection of someone who had raised 5 children of her own and had no patience left for unnecessary worry, only for the real kind. She packed the car with the same pragmatic thoroughness she had brought to every practical problem of her adult life. Tools she had borrowed or bought secondhand, tarps, cleaning supplies, enough food for 2 weeks, a sleeping bag, a camp stove. Carmen called while she was loading the car. "You're actually going?" Carmen said. It was not a question. "I leave tomorrow morning." A pause. "Elena, you understand there's nothing there. There's 4 acres in a stone structure. A collapsed stone structure in the middle of nowhere. You're going to sleep there? The storage building is sound. I checked. You checked. Carmen's voice had that quality. It got sometimes like she was holding something fragile with too much care. You are a 40-year-old woman with 2 children and no savings, taking unpaid leave from your job to stay alone in a ruin. Do you hear how that sounds? I'm 38, Elena said. Carmen said other things after that, and Elena listened with the patience she had developed over years of listening to people describe her situation as though she had not already considered it. She understood Carmen's concern. She even understood that some of it came from love. But there was a particular species of worry that was less about the person being worried over and more about the person doing the worrying, a need to have one's caution validated, one's realism affirmed. Elena did not have the luxury of that kind of worry. She had only the kind that led somewhere. She left at 5 in the morning to avoid traffic. The children were still asleep when she kissed them goodbye. Marco's hair smelling of the shampoo. She had been buying him since he was small. Sophia's face entirely peaceful in the way children's faces are when they sleep, as if they go somewhere kinder in their dreams. Dolores answered the door in her bathrobe, took the car keys for emergencies, patted Elena's hand once, and told her to be careful, to call when she arrived, and not to lift anything foolish by herself. The drive felt different in the dark. The roads were emptier, the landscape more abstract, fields and tree lines passing in and out of her headlights without the detail that daylight provided. She drove with the radio off. She had not slept well, and the quiet was useful, a space to settle into the day ahead without noise contaminating it. By the time she arrived, the sun had been up for an hour. It caught the stone walls at a low angle, and for a moment, before practicality reasserted itself, she saw what the place must have looked like when it was whole. The stone was beautiful in that light. Not picturesque exactly, but solid and deliberate. The kind of construction that implied something about the people who had raised it, that they had expected it to last, that they had built accordingly. She had arranged to stay in the intact storage building for the duration. On her first visit, she had identified it as the most structurally reliable of the outbuildings, and a second look now confirmed that assessment. The roof held. The walls were sound. The door, when she applied steady pressure to its swollen frame, opened reluctantly but completely. The interior was exactly as she had left it, cool, dry, dusty. She swept it out, set up her sleeping area in the far corner, arranged her supplies along the shelves after removing the old bottles and tools. She made it functional without making it comfortable, because comfort was not what she had come for. Then she went to work. The first days were about clearing. She worked from the perimeter inward, moving fallen vegetation, cutting back the growth that had advanced against the walls, hauling debris to a collection point she established at the northern edge of the property. The physical labor was total and clarifying in the way that sustained hard work sometimes is. It left no room for anything that wasn't immediately necessary. Her thoughts narrowed to the task at hand, to the weight of the wheelbarrow, to the angle required to lever a stone that had shifted, to the sequence of decisions that filled each hour. She discovered things as she cleared. Most of them were unremarkable in isolation. Fragments of old ceramic tile, scraps of iron hardware, the remnants of what had once been a garden bed along the south-facing wall, its raised stone edging still partially intact beneath decades of overgrowth. Each discovery was small, each one a piece of ordinary domestic history, the residue of a life lived in this place before silence claimed it. She collected them without ceremony, setting the intact pieces aside, disposing of the deteriorated ones, building a rough inventory in her mind of what remained. On the 4th day, she began work on the main ruin in earnest. She had already decided that the primary task was not construction but excavation, not building something new, but uncovering what remained. The stone walls that still stood were the asset. They were too substantial, too well cut, to have been ordinary farm construction. The same stones that had collapsed could, in principle, be repositioned, given the right assessment, the right plan, the right hands. But before any of that could happen, the interior needed to be cleared of the decades of accumulated debris that covered the original floor. the leaves and soil and branches and general drift of time that had filled the space since the roof came down. She started in the southeast corner, where the wall was highest and the debris accumulation shallowest. She worked with a shovel, a brush, and her gloves, removing material in layers, careful and methodical, setting aside anything that seemed out of place. Most of what she found in the upper layers was vegetable matter, leaves, decomposed wood, compacted dirt. Beneath that older material, ash in some sections, as though fires had been built here at some point after the roof fell. Fragments of glass from windows long broken. More ceramic tile. And then, on the fifth day, in a section near the eastern wall where the debris layer was deeper than she had expected, she found something that made her stop. She had been working at a slight depression in the debris surface, a low area that she had assumed reflected a difference in how material had accumulated, the way water tends to settle and compress whatever it carries. As she cleared it, the depression deepened in a way that the surrounding terrain did not. She cleared more material, widening her area of work, and the pattern became unmistakable. She was not excavating a depression created by natural drift. She was uncovering the edge of something, a deliberate shape beneath the debris, too regular in its geometry to be accidental. She set down her shovel. She knelt and used her hands, brushing away the finer material with care. The shape resolved slowly beneath her fingers. Stone, worked stone, fitted together in a configuration that was clearly intentional. The pieces were smaller than the wall stones, cut more precisely, arranged in a pattern she could not yet see fully because most of it was still buried. She sat back and looked at what she had uncovered so far. A section perhaps half a meter long, a few centimeters wide, the edge of something that lay beneath the floor level of the ruin itself. The light was fading. She had been working for most of the day. Her arms ached, and her back had been making its objections known for the past 2 hours. She covered the area carefully with a tarp weighted down with stones, marking the location with a piece of wire bent into a visible shape. Then she walked back to the storage building, made her dinner on the camp stove, and sat in the doorway watching the last light leave the sky. She did not let herself speculate. She had learned long ago that speculation was expensive, that spent hope before anything was confirmed. Whatever lay beneath the floor of the ruin, it was old. It had been there long before she arrived and would wait until morning. There was nothing to be gained by imagining. But as she lay down that night in her sleeping bag in the quiet of the old storage building, with the sound of the wind moving through the stone walls outside and the smell of cold earth surrounding her, she found that the discipline of not speculating required more effort than it usually did. Something was under there. She had felt the shape of it. She knew that much. She slept poorly. In the morning, she was at the site before the light was fully established, pulling back the tarp, kneeling in the damp and the cold, resuming the work. She moved faster now, not carelessly, but with a purpose that had shifted slightly overnight, sharpened by the waiting. She cleared the area methodically, widening the excavation, keeping her depth consistent, never rushing. By mid-morning, the shape was clear enough to see. It was a door, or rather, it was the cover of something, a stone-framed hatch set into what had been the original floor of the structure. Its surface made of the same fitted stonework as the walls, its edges carefully sealed at some point with a mortar that had partially failed over time, leaving gaps along two sides. The whole thing measured roughly 1 meter by 1.5 meters. It had a recessed iron ring set into one end, the metal dark with rust but intact. It had been built by someone who knew what they were doing. It had been built to last, and it had been covered, not by accident, not by the simple drift of decades, but deliberately by someone who had placed material over it with the specific intention that it should not be found easily. Elena sat on her heels and looked at it for a long time. The wind moved through the open ruin around her. A bird called from somewhere beyond the eastern wall. The young tree that grew from the center of the space shifted its branches slowly. The iron ring caught the morning light and held it. She thought of Carmen's voice on the phone. Rubble. She thought of the 2 cousins who had signed refusal letters without visiting. She thought of the lawyer's brief, uninflected description. uninhabitable in its current condition. And she thought about the word condition, which implied not permanence, but a moment in time, a state of affairs that could change. She reached out and closed her fingers around the iron ring. She did not pull yet. She had learned enough, in 38 years of careful living, to know that some moments required a breath before they became irreversible. So she took one. She felt the cold metal against her palm. She felt the weight of the stone beneath her knees, the weight of the ruin around her, the weight of everything that had led her here. The letter in the parking lot, the bread bought with an employee discount, the children asleep when she left in the dark, the long drive through fields she could not see. And then she pulled. The stone cover resisted. It was not locked. There was no mechanism she could find, no latch or bar, but it had been in place for long enough that the earth around its edges had compacted into something close to adhesion, the weight of decades pressing it down into its frame as firmly as mortar. She pulled steadily, not in bursts, not with panic, but with the patient, sustained effort she had learned to apply to things that required it. Her arms burned. The iron ring bit into her palm. Then, with a sound that was less a crack than an exhalation, the release of air that had been held for a very long time, the cover shifted. She did not throw it open. She eased it up slowly, controlling the movement, letting it rest against the intact section of wall beside her rather than dropping it onto the ground where it might shatter or sink out of position. She wanted to be able to replace it exactly as it had been. She did not yet know why that instinct was so strong. She only knew that it was. The opening beneath was dark. Cold air rose from it, the same preserved coolness she had noticed in the storage building, but deeper, more concentrated, carrying a smell she could not immediately name. Old stone, dry earth, and something underneath those things, something that had been sealed away from weather and light for a long time. Not rot, not decay, preservation. The smell of things that had not changed because nothing had been allowed to disturb them. She sat at the edge and listened. Nothing moved below. No water, no settling sound, no indication of any living presence. The silence from the opening was total, the kind of silence that had texture, solid and deliberate and old. She had brought her flashlight to the site that morning as a matter of habit. She turned it on now and directed the beam downward. The opening led to a stone stairway, 6 steps, wide and carefully cut, descending to a level floor. The walls of the chamber below were stone, the same dark stone as the ruin above, but fitted here with a precision that exceeded anything visible in the surface structure. The floor appeared to be packed earth, level and firm. The ceiling was low, perhaps 1.5 meters at its highest point, but intact. From the top of the stairs, she could see that the space extended beyond the reach of her flashlight. It was larger than the opening suggested. She went down. Each step held her weight without sound. The stone was solid, the construction sure. Whatever this chamber had been built for, it had been built to last without maintenance, to function without attention, to endure. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped and swept the flashlight slowly around the space. The chamber was rectangular, perhaps 8 meters long and 4 wide. The walls were bare stone, clean, not dusty in the way that abandoned spaces become dusty, but clear, as though the sealed air had preserved them against the ordinary accumulation of time. Along the left wall, a series of stone niches had been cut directly into the rock. Shallow recesses, evenly spaced, each approximately the size of a large box. Most of them were empty, their surfaces clean and pale in the flashlight beam. But some were not empty. She moved to the nearest occupied niche and looked at what it contained. Ceramic. Vessels. Large ones, sealed with fired clay stoppers, their surfaces dark with age but intact. She counted 4 in the first niche, 6 in the second, 3 in the third. They varied in size, some no larger than a wine bottle, others wide-bellied and substantial, the kind of vessel that could hold considerable volume. She did not touch them. Not yet. She only looked, moving slowly along the wall, cataloging what she saw with the same methodical attention she had brought to the surface clearing. More niches, more vessels. Then, midway along the wall, something different, a niche that held not ceramic but metal. She leaned closer. Boxes, she thought at first. Then she adjusted the flashlight angle, and the word that came to her instead was caskets. Not in the funerary sense, but in the older sense, the word for a small chest meant to hold something of value. There were 7 of them, each roughly the size of shoebox. Made of a dark metal she could not immediately identify in the poor light, their surfaces plain and undecorated, each secured with a simple hasp that had been twisted closed but not locked. She stood very still, the flashlight held steady in her hand. She was aware of her own breathing, of the cold of the underground space against her arms, of the weight of the ruin above her, and the weight of the earth that surrounded it. She was aware, in a way that was almost physical, of the distance between where she was standing and the world above. The road, the nearest town, Carmen's voice on the phone, the parking lot where she had read the letter, the apartment with the broken radiator, and the children who were somewhere in it right now, sleeping or waking into their ordinary morning. She did not open the caskets. She understood, in a clear and unhurried way, that opening them required preparation she had not yet made. Not emotional preparation, but practical preparation. She needed to know what she was looking at before she knew what to do with it. Reaching into the dark and pulling out whatever was there without context or knowledge was the kind of action that could turn a discovery into a mistake. She had made enough mistakes in her life that she recognized the shape of one approaching. She stepped back from the niches, turned, and went up the stairs. Outside, in the gray morning air of the ruin, she sat down on a fallen stone and breathed. She called Dolores. The children were fine. Marco had eaten 2 breakfasts. Sophia had found a caterpillar in the garden and was treating it with the focused devotion she brought to all animals. Dolores said the word fine the way she always said it, as a complete sentence, requiring no elaboration. Elena thanked her and hung up. She sat for a while longer, watching the light change on the stone walls. Then she made a decision. She needed help, not Carmen's help. Carmen would arrive with conclusions already formed and present them as facts. Not the kind of help that meant handing the situation over to someone else, either. She needed the kind of help that added knowledge without taking ownership. She needed someone who could look at what she had found and tell her what she was seeing. There was a man named Rodrigo Saenz who had taught history at the secondary school in the town where Elena had grown up. He was in his 70s now, retired, and she had not spoken to him in years. But he was the kind of person who had spent his life accumulating precise and specific knowledge about the region's past, who still answered his phone on the first ring, who would come if asked and would not make the coming into a story about himself. She called him. He listened without interruption while she described what she had found. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to mean something. Then he said, "Don't move anything. Don't open anything. I'll come tomorrow morning." He arrived at 8, driving a small car that struggled on the last section of dirt road. He was shorter than she remembered, thinner, with the careful movements of someone managing a body that had begun to require management. He brought a leather bag with tools she recognized as the kind archaeologists used: fine brushes, small picks, measuring tape, a camera with a proper lens. He had clearly not assumed that what she described would be unremarkable. He did not speak much as she led him to the ruin. He moved slowly, looking at the walls as he walked, touching certain stones with the flat of his hand, pausing at intervals in a way that had nothing performative about it. When they reached the hatch, he crouched and examined the stone cover where she had leaned it against the wall. He looked at the frame. He traced the fitted edges with his finger. Then he looked up at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between confirmation and restraint, as though he had suspected something and was now deciding how much to say about it. "How old?" she asked. "The construction style is consistent with structures in this region from roughly the 16th to the early 18th century, he said. "Possibly earlier. The stonework in the chamber, if it matches what you described, could narrow that estimate." He paused. "This is not common, Elena. Sealed underground chambers of this type, attached to surface structures of this period. There are examples, but they're not common." What were they used for? He considered the question with the patience of someone who did not give quick answers to questions that deserve slower ones. "That depends entirely on what's inside." They went down together. He moved differently in the chamber than she had, more slowly, with a kind of reverence that was not theatrical but genuine, the reverence of someone encountering something they had spent decades reading about and never expected to stand in front of. He directed his own light along the walls, examined the niches, looked at the empty ones, and then the occupied ones. When he reached the ceramic vessels, he spent a long time without touching, only looking. When he reached the metal caskets, he stopped entirely. He stood before them for perhaps 2 full minutes. Elena waited. "May I?" he said finally, gesturing toward the nearest casket. She nodded. He lifted it from the niche with both hands, set it on the floor, and crouched before it. He worked the hasp open with careful fingers, not forcing it, managing the resistance of old metal until it gave. Then he opened the lid. The contents were wrapped in material that had once been cloth and was now something between fabric and paper, fragile and discolored, preserved by the sealed conditions of the chamber, but clearly at the edge of its endurance. He peeled back the layers with the same deliberate care he had brought to everything else. Beneath the wrapping, something caught the flashlight and threw it back. Gold, not ore, not raw material. Worked gold, coins small and thick, their surfaces bearing designs that Elena could not read from her angle. Rodrigo picked one up and held it to the light. He turned it over. He set it down. He picked up another, examined it the same way, set it down. "How old?" Elena said again. It was less a question this time than a statement of what she needed to know. "Colonial period," he said. His voice was steady, but something in it had changed, a quality of containment, as though he were managing something that wanted to expand. "Spanish colonial coinage. The design here, this is consistent with pieces minted in the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries." He paused. "These are not common finds, Elena. Single specimens appear occasionally in collections and sales. A quantity of this kind," he stopped. "I need to see what else is here before I say anything further." They spent 3 hours in the chamber that day. Rodrigo worked methodically, documenting each niche before touching anything, photographing, measuring. He opened each casket in turn. The first 3 held coins, different denominations, different mints, but all consistent in period. The 4th held something that made him sit back on his heels and rest his hands on his knees for a moment before continuing. Jewelry. A necklace of worked gold set with stones he identified cautiously as likely emeralds, with the caveat that identification would require a gemologist. Rings, several of them, some plain, some set with stones. A brooch of unusual complexity, its design incorporating figures he recognized as consistent with the iconography of a specific colonial period. The ceramic vessels, when he carefully opened the stoppers of several with her permission, contained different things in different vessels. Some held oil that had long since thickened to a near solid. Others held what appeared to be documents, rolled and sealed, their paper or vellum darkened, but intact in the preserved conditions of the chamber. By the time they climbed back into the daylight, the afternoon had advanced and the light on the stone walls had gone golden. Elena sat on the same fallen stone she had used that morning. Rodrigo stood nearby, looking at the ruin with an expression she now recognized as the one he had been managing since they descended. Not quite shock, but its disciplined older cousin. "Tell me," she said. He sat down on a nearby stone, set his bag between his feet, and looked at her directly. "What you have found is, in my assessment, a deliberate concealment of significant personal wealth. The construction of the chamber, its placement within the structure, the method of sealing. This was not accidental accumulation. Someone carried these items here, placed them in that chamber, sealed it, and either did not return or could not return. The age of the materials is consistent with the chamber being sealed no later than the early 18th century, possibly earlier. 300 years, Elena said. At minimum." He paused. "The quantity of coinage alone, if authenticated, and I want to be careful here because I'm a historian, not an appraiser, but the quantity alone represents something exceptional. Colonial gold coins of this period and in this condition are rare enough that single specimens sell for thousands of euros in authenticated sales. A collection of this size and apparent coherence." He paused again. with the discipline of someone who understood that numbers spoken aloud in uncertain moments took on a life of their own. I cannot give you a number. I'm not qualified to give you a number. What I can tell you is that this requires formal assessment by people with the proper expertise, and it requires legal guidance about what your obligations and rights are under the patrimony and cultural heritage laws applicable to this type of find. Elena absorbed this. Is it mine? That is precisely the question that requires legal guidance. In principle, if the find is on your property and meets certain criteria, there are provisions under which the finder retains significant rights to the material, though the state may claim a portion or the right of first purchase at assessed value. The specific application depends on factors I am not qualified to determine. He looked at her steadily. What I can tell you is that you have found something genuine. I do not say that casually. She thanked him. He offered to help her identify the right people to contact, an archaeologist he trusted at a university in the nearest city, a lawyer who specialized in cultural heritage claims. He made these offers quietly, without inserting himself into the center of them, the way a person offers help when they mean it rather than when they want to be part of the story. After he left, Elena sat alone in the ruin for a long time. The hatch was closed again, the stone cover replaced exactly as she had found it, the debris redistributed over it. From above, looking at the section of cleared floor, nothing was visible. Nothing announced itself. The chamber was there, below the earth, below the stone, holding what it had held for 3 centuries in the same patient dark. She thought about telling Carmen. She thought about the particular quality of that phone call, the way Carmen's voice would change, the way the conversation would reorganize itself around Carmen's response to the information rather than around the information itself. She decided not to call Carmen yet. She called Dolores instead to check on the children. Marco had made Sophia a paper boat, and they had floated it in a bowl of water in the garden. Sophia's caterpillar had been installed in a jar with holes punched in the lid. Everything was fine. She thanked Dolores and hung up and sat with the phone in her hand in the quieting afternoon. What she felt was not what she had expected to feel. She had expected something operatic, the crash of realization, the overwhelming surge of emotion that stories described when a person's life pivoted on a single point. What she felt instead was something quieter and more structural, like a wall being built rather than a ceiling collapsing. Something solid being added, incrementally, to a foundation that had been holding under pressure for a long time. She was not there yet. She understood that clearly. There were processes ahead of her, legal, bureaucratic, procedural, that would take time, that could complicate everything, that might reduce what she had found to something considerably less transformative than what Rodrigo's careful language had suggested. She did not allow herself to spend what had not yet arrived in her hands. She had learned that lesson expensively and would not relearn it. But she allowed herself this. She sat in the open ruin with the late light on the old stones, and she let herself feel, for the first time in a very long time, the particular sensation of a situation that was moving toward her rather than away from her. Not gratitude exactly. Not relief. Something older and more fundamental than either of those things. The feeling of ground under your feet after a long time of finding none. In the days that followed, she continued to work. This was important to her, that the discovery did not stop the labor. She cleared more of the ruin interior, documenting the floor plan as it emerged, photographing the wall sections in their existing state. She repaired a section of the storage building's roof, where a beam had begun to fail, working with timber she had sourced from a salvage yard in the nearest town. She established proper drainage around the most vulnerable wall sections. The work was not glamorous. It was not the work of someone who had already decided that the future was secure. It was the work of someone who understood that security had to be built from the present, not borrowed from the future. She heard from Rodrigo's archaeologist contact within the week. The woman, Dr. Inés Carvalho, drove out on a Thursday morning and spent the day in the chamber with equipment Elena had not known existed. A handheld spectrometer that could assess metal composition without physical samples. A camera system for document imaging that captured detail invisible to the naked eye. She worked without theatrics, asking questions in a professional shorthand that assumed knowledge Elena did not have, but translated when she asked. At the end of the day, she sat with Elena at the entrance to the storage building with 2 cups of coffee from the thermos Elena had prepared and gave her assessment in the same manner she had worked, directly, without cushioning. "The coins are genuine," she said. "The alloy composition is consistent with colonial period minting. Several of the pieces are identifiable types. I can point you to existing literature that describes them. The jewelry requires gemological assessment for the stones, but the metalwork is period consistent and the craftsmanship on several pieces is exceptional. The documents," she paused, with the controlled care of someone about to say something that they had spent time preparing. "The documents require specialist analysis, but the preliminary imaging suggests some of them are records, inventory documents, possibly, which, if authenticated, would provide context for the origin of the collection." She looked at Elena steadily. "This is a significant find. I do not make that assessment lightly." "What does significant mean?" Elena said. Dr. Carvalho considered the question with the same precision she brought to the rest of her work. "It means that a proper appraisal, conducted by qualified specialists in colonial period material, is likely to produce numbers that will be meaningful to you. How meaningful depends on factors outside my competence. The legal framework, the condition assessment by other specialists, the market for this type of material." She paused. "But I can tell you that in my professional experience, finds of this type and apparent scope are not common. They are in fact rare." Elena's hands were wrapped around the thermos cup. The coffee had gone cold. She drank it anyway. The phone call to Carmen happened the following Saturday, not because Elena had decided the time was right, but because Carmen called her first. Checking in, she said, with a particular quality in her voice that suggested she had been prepared for the conversation to go a certain way. Elena listened to her sister's questions, answered them plainly, and then, when Carmen had finished circling, said what needed to be said. "I found something in the ruin." A pause. "What kind of something?" "A sealed chamber. Underground. It contains colonial period gold coins, jewelry, and documents. I've had it assessed by a historian and an archaeologist. Both have confirmed it's genuine. I'm working with a heritage lawyer to establish my legal position." The silence that followed was different from Carmen's usual silences. It was not the silence of someone preparing a response. It was the silence of someone whose prepared response had become suddenly inapplicable. "Elena," Carmen said finally. "I know. How much? I don't know yet. The assessment process takes time. I'm not spending anything that isn't confirmed. I'm not changing anything until the legal situation is clear." Another silence. Then Carmen said, in a voice that was smaller than her usual voice, the voice she had used when they were girls and she had gotten something badly wrong. "I told you it was rubble." "You did," Elena said. Not unkindly, just accurately. The news moved the way news moves in small communities. Not in announcements, but in the particular drift of information through the gaps between people. Elena had not spoken about the find publicly, had not posted anything, had not told anyone beyond Rodrigo, Dr. Carvalho, and Carmen. But the archaeologist's car had been seen at the property. Rodrigo was a known figure in the region, and a known figure making a day-long drive to a remote ruin was the kind of information that traveled. The heritage lawyer's name was attached to a firm that handled a certain class of case. People who noticed things put the pieces together. The first sign of it reached her through Dolores. A neighbor of Dolores's, who had a sister in the nearest town, had mentioned hearing that something had been found at the old Vasquez property. Was it true? Dolores reported this to Elena with the flat precision of someone delivering a weather report. Neither alarmed nor excited, just accurate. Elena confirmed that yes, she had found something and asked Dolores to discourage speculation. Dolores said she would do her best, in a tone that suggested she considered this an optimistic goal but would make the attempt. 3 days later, a man appeared at the property. Elena was working on the north wall, clearing the last section of overgrowth from its base, when she heard a car on the access track and straightened to look. He was middle-aged, well-dressed in a way that was slightly wrong for the terrain, carrying a business card he produced before he introduced himself. He represented, he said, a private collection based in the capital. Discretion guaranteed, acquisition handled cleanly, competitive offers made without process or delay. He had heard that she might have material of historical interest. She looked at the card. She looked at him. She said, "Thank you." She was not selling anything at this time, and she was working with legal counsel. He smiled in the practiced way of someone who was used to initial resistance and considered it part of the process, said of course, left his card, walked back to his car. She watched him go, and she went back to clearing the wall. That evening, she called the heritage lawyer and mentioned the visit. The lawyer was not surprised. He was a compact, direct man in his 50s who had handled enough of these cases to move without waste. He told her what she already half knew, that interest would increase as word spread, that certain types of contact should be directed to him, that her position was solidifying through the proper channels but was not yet formalized. He also told her, for the first time, a number, preliminary, contingent, conditional on a full appraisal, that represented the lower end of what the known material might be expected to yield under the applicable legal framework. She wrote it down. She looked at it for a while after she hung up. Then she folded the paper and put it in the same pocket where she had once put a letter in a parking lot, standing between two cars with the wind cutting through her jacket, feeling nothing that resembled hope. She felt something now. She kept it folded and close. She did not let it out until she was certain of it. But it was there. That night, she called Marco and Sophia. Marco wanted to know if she had found any old weapons. Sophia wanted to know if the caterpillar could come visit the property because it might like old stones. She told Marco that she hadn't found any weapons, that the things she'd found were older and stranger than weapons, that she would tell them everything when she saw them. She told Sophia that the caterpillar was very welcome, that the property had excellent stone. After she hung up, the storage building was quiet around her. The old timber walls held the cold out adequately. The repaired section of roof sat solid and properly fitted the way things sat when they had been done correctly. Outside, the ruin was dark, the open walls admitting only the thin scatter of stars. Below the floor of the ruin, 300 years of patience waited to be properly counted. Elena lay down and closed her eyes, and for the first time since arriving at the property, she did not think about what came next. She thought about Marco eating 2 breakfasts at Dolores's table. She thought about Sophia's caterpillar in its jar with the holes punched in the lid. She thought about the feel of cold iron against her palm on the morning she pulled the hatch open, the weight of it, the resistance, the moment before it gave. She thought about the word rubble. She thought about how much you could be wrong about a thing when you judged it before you had cleared away everything that was covering it. And then she slept deeply without dreaming, the way people sleep when they have done something real with their day and the ground beneath them is solid. The appraisal process took 11 weeks. Elena had been warned it would take time, and she had accepted that warning with the same equanimity she brought to most things that could not be hurried. But accepting something in principle and living through it in practice were different experiences, and the 11 weeks tested the distance between them in ways she had not fully anticipated. She returned to her apartment, to her shifts at the grocery store, to the children's routines, and the broken radiator, and the gap in the kitchen window she had sealed with towel strips and tape. She returned to the ordinary architecture of her life, and she carried inside it, very quietly, the knowledge of what was happening in a law office and a university laboratory and 2 specialist assessment firms, without being able to speak of it freely or act on it, or even fully believe in it on the days when ordinary life pressed in hard enough to make everything else feel distant and provisional. She did not tell the children yet. This was a deliberate choice, made carefully and reconsidered several times before she held to it. Marco was 11 and Sophia was 8, and they were old enough to understand more than she sometimes gave them credit for. But they were also young enough that hope, once offered, became a structural element of how they moved through their days. If the legal process produced less than expected, if the state exercised rights she had not anticipated, if the appraisal came in lower, if any of the dozen contingencies the lawyer had outlined in careful, responsible detail came to pass, she did not want them to have built a life on a number that had not yet solidified. She would tell them when she had something certain to tell. Until then, she would be exactly what she had always been, present, steady, making dinner, reading to them at night. She told two people, Rodrigo, who already knew, and a woman named Pilar, who had been her closest friend since childhood and who received the information with the particular quality of silence that meant she was trying very hard not to cry. Pilar asked one question. Are you sure it's real? Elena said yes. Pilar said okay. Then she said, after a pause, I never doubted you. Elena said gently, you didn't know about it until just now. Pilar said, I mean in general. I never doubted you in general. Elena said thank you, and they talked about other things for the rest of the call. And when she hung up, she sat for a few minutes with the feeling that Pilar's words had left behind. Not warmth exactly, but something that had the same effect. The grocery store was its ordinary self. The shelves needed stocking. The early shift started before the light arrived. The discount bread was still the best option on a certain budget. Her manager, a tired man named Fortunato who ran the store with the energy of someone who had given most of it away years ago and was operating on what remained, noticed nothing different about her. Why would he? She had not changed anything. She was the same person who had always stocked the shelves at that hour. And she did it with the same competence she always had, because competence was what you brought to work regardless of what else was happening in your life. That was a principle she had absorbed so early it no longer felt like a principle. It felt like weather. There was something almost clarifying about the ordinariness of those weeks. She had expected the waiting to feel like suspension, like being held between one life and another, neither fully inhabiting the old one nor permitted to enter the new. Instead, it felt like confirmation. The routine she had built through years of necessity turned out to be more than coping mechanisms. They were, she began to understand, the actual substance of who she was. The woman who got up before the light, who stocked shelves with precision, who sealed window gaps with what she had available and made it hold. That woman was not a version of herself diminished by circumstances. She was the version that circumstances had revealed. The appraisal could not add to that. It could only change the conditions in which it operated. At home, the children were their ordinary selves in the ways that mattered and different in the small ways that children become different when you're paying close attention, when you have recently been reminded of what it is you're working for. Marco had started staying up too late reading, a habit she technically disapproved of and practically admired, because the books were good ones, because the habit came from her, because she could not fully argue with something she had done herself at his age. Sophia had developed an intense interest in the construction of things, specifically in how walls were built, which Elena suspected was connected to the photographs she had left on her phone from the property. The stone walls, the arched entrance, the chamber stairs, which Sophia had found and examined with focused thoroughness while Elena was making dinner one evening. Sophia asked about the photographs. Elena said they were from the old property she had been visiting. Sophia asked if the walls were very old. Elena said very old, several hundred years. Sophia considered this and asked if they were older than Dolores. Elena said yes, considerably older than Dolores. Sophia seemed satisfied and returned to her drawing, which turned out to be a detailed and surprisingly accurate sketch of the arched entrance, with a small figure standing beneath it that Elena recognized, after a moment, as herself. She kept the drawing. The first formal document arrived in the 8th week. It was from the Cultural Heritage Assessment Office, a preliminary classification of the find as a discovery of significant historical and cultural interest, which triggered the formal valuation process under the applicable patrimony law. The lawyer walked her through what it meant in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes. The classification was good news. It formalized her position as the finder and property owner, established the legal framework under which any financial resolution would occur, and set in motion the independent appraisal that would produce the numbers everything else depended on. She thanked him and went back to stacking shelves. In the 10th week, Carmen called. The call was different from the others they had exchanged since Elena had told her about the find. Carmen had called several times in the intervening weeks, checking in, she said, asking careful questions, offering information about lawyers she knew and processes she had read about, the impulse to manage finding its expression in research and referrals now that the original dismissal had been so thoroughly dismantled. Elena had accepted the calls with the patient generosity she brought to most of Carmen's behavior, which was the generosity of someone who understood where it came from even when it was difficult. But this call was different. Carmen said, at the beginning of it, before any other subject could be introduced, I need to say something, and I need to say it properly, not as part of another conversation. Elena waited. Carmen said, I told you it was rubble. I told you there was nothing there. I told you couldn't manage it. I was wrong, completely wrong, on every part of it, and I said it with more certainty than I had any right to have. And I'm sorry. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Elena said, Thank you. Carmen said, I was scared for you. That's not an excuse. But it's true. Elena said, I know. Carmen said, I should have come with you the first time instead of telling you not to go. Elena said, Yes, you should have. There was a sound on Carmen's end of the call that Elena recognized. She had heard it perhaps 4 times in her life because Carmen had always been the one who did not make that sound, the one who held things together, the one whose composure was structural rather than performed. But she was making it now, quietly, and Elena let her, without rushing past it or filling the space with reassurance. Then Carmen said, in the smaller voice, You were always the stronger one. I just never want to say it because I was the older one and it wasn't supposed to be that way. Elena thought about that for a moment. Then she said, I wasn't stronger. I just didn't have the option of stopping. And Carmen, who understood what that meant, said nothing for a moment, and then said, I know that. And I'm sorry it was like that. They talked for 2 hours that night. Not about the property, not about the appraisal, not about numbers or processes or legal frameworks. They talked about their mother, who had been dead for 6 years and whom they had both grieved in private and parallel ways that had never quite merged into shared grief. They talked about their childhood, about specific memories they had never compared before. The same events rendered slightly differently by 2 different sets of eyes, neither version wrong, both incomplete. They talked about the children, whom Carmen loved impractically and visited too rarely. They talked until Elena's phone battery was at 3%, and she had to say good night before it died entirely. After she hung up, the apartment was quiet. The radiator made its personality noises in the hall. Sophia was asleep with the light still on, a book open beside her. Marco's door was closed, which meant he was either asleep or reading, and she had decided months ago that the latter was not worth interrupting. She stood in the hallway between their doors and held the phone in her hand and felt the weight of the evening settling. It was not triumphant. It was not cinematic. It was the particular feeling of a thing that had been wrong for a long time beginning, slowly, to come right, not with a crash, not with a revelation, but with the quiet incremental process of 2 people deciding to be honest with each other past the point where honesty was comfortable. The formal appraisal arrived in the 11th week. The lawyer called her at 7 in the morning, which was unusual enough that she knew before he spoke that the document had come. She was in the kitchen, still in her work clothes from the early shift, eating toast standing at the counter. She set the toast down. He read her the summary. He had warned her, across many conversations, that appraisal documents were written in language designed to be precise rather than comprehensible, and he had promised to translate. He kept that promise now, moving through the sections in plain language, explaining methodology, noting the caveats and conditions that were standard to formal assessments of this kind, making sure she understood what was confirmed and what remained contingent. The coins, 437 pieces, colonial period, authenticated, ranging in individual assessed value from several hundred to several thousand euros per piece, depending on rarity and condition. Collective assessed value of the coin collection, his voice remained steady as he said the number, was in excess of 2 million euros. Elena set her hand flat on the counter. The jewelry, 11 pieces total, including the necklace, assessed by both a gemologist and a specialist in colonial period metalwork. The stones in the necklace were confirmed emeralds, Colombian, consistent in origin profile with colonial-era pieces. The necklace alone, he paused here, in the way he paused when he wanted to make sure she was with him, was assessed at between 350,000 and 420,000 euros. The remaining pieces, collectively, an additional 280,000. Elena's hand on the counter was very still. The documents, 14 individual items, ranging in condition from fragile to well-preserved, assessed by a specialist in colonial period manuscripts. Several were identified as inventory records from a merchant operation. 2 were identified as letters of credit, instruments that had no modern financial value, but whose historical and academic significance placed them in a separate category of cultural interest. The documents as a group were assessed at between 180,000 and 240,000 euros for direct sale to qualified institutional buyers, with the caveat that the state right of first acquisition applied. He paused. Then he said, "The total assessed value of the collection, taking the midpoint of the ranges given, is approximately 3.2 million euros. The applicable law provides for a finder's share of the assessed value, after state acquisition rights are exercised, of between 60 and 70%, depending on the outcome of the formal cultural heritage designation process." The lawyer's expectation, based on precedent, was a figure in the upper range of that provision. Elena looked at the counter. She looked at her hand on the counter. She looked at the half-eaten piece of toast beside her hand. She said, "Can you say the total number again?" He said it again. She said, "And my share?" He said, "At 65%, which is the median precedent outcome for a find of this type and significance. Approximately 2,080,000 euros. Potentially higher, not lower, in his professional assessment, barring unexpected complications, which he did not anticipate." She thanked him. He told her there were next steps to discuss, documents to sign, a timeline that would now begin moving. She said she understood and asked if they could schedule a call for the following day, because she needed a few hours first. He said of course, and said one more thing before they hung up. "You navigated this exactly right from the beginning. That matters in these cases. You protected the find, you went through proper channels, you didn't make moves that would have complicated your position. Not everyone does that when the stakes are high. Well done." She thanked him and hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. The toast was cold. The light from the window was the flat, early light of a morning that had not yet decided what kind of day it would be. The gap in the window frame that she had sealed with towel strips and tape let in a small thread of cold air, the way it always did, because the seal was good but not perfect, and nothing she had ever been able to afford had been perfect. She thought about the apartment and what it would mean to leave it. She thought about the school the children went to and whether they would want to leave it. She thought about Dolores 3 doors down and what it would mean to not be 3 doors from Dolores. She thought about her grocery store shifts and Fortunato and the discount bread and the early mornings and all the small precise adjustments that had composed her life for the past several years. And she thought about which of them she had kept because she had to, and which of them she had come to value in the way that things valued under constraint sometimes surprise you when the constraint is lifted. Then she went to Sophia's room. Sophia was awake, lying in bed with her book from the night before, reading with the expression she got when she had forgotten that the world existed outside what she was reading. Elena sat on the edge of the bed. Sophia looked up. "Can you get Marco?" Elena said, "I need to tell you both something." Sophia's expression shifted into the focused assessment mode she used for puzzles and caterpillars and other things requiring serious attention. She got up without asking why and went to get her brother. They sat on Sophia's bed together, Marco still half asleep, Sophia straight-backed and alert. Elena looked at them, at Marco's uncombed hair and Sophia's careful eyes and the drawing of the stone arch that was pinned to the wall behind them, the small figure standing beneath it, and she felt the thing she had been keeping folded and close since the night she had first heard the number, keeping it contained until she was certain of it, until it was real enough to give away. She let out now. It filled the room. She told them everything. She told them about the letter in the parking lot. She told them about the drive in the dark. She told them about the ruin and the clearing and the 5 days of work before the shape emerged beneath her hands in the cold. She told them about the iron ring and the exhalation of air that had been held for 300 years and the darkness below and the stone niches and the caskets and the gold coins that Rodrigo had held up to the light and turned over in his careful historian's hands. She told them about the 11 weeks of waiting. She told them the number. Marco, who was 11 and had been raised to understand money with the precision that children raised without enough of it always understand money, went very still. Then he said, "Is that real?" Elena said, "Yes." He said, "That's enough to." She said, "Yes." He thought about this with the focused gravity of someone doing important calculations. Then he said, "Sophia's caterpillar can have a whole garden." Sophia, who had been quiet through all of it in the way she was quiet when she was absorbing something too large for immediate response, looked at her brother and then at her mother and then at the drawing on the wall. She said, "You were the small person in the drawing." Elena said, "Yes." Sophia said, "I drew it because you looked like you were home." The room was quiet. Outside, the morning had decided what kind of day it would be. Clear, cold, the kind of light that made edges sharp. The radiator in the hall made its sounds. The sealed window gap let in its thread of air. Elena put her arms around both of them, and they let her, the way children let you, when they understand that the embrace is as much for you as for them. She held them for a long time. Marco, who had inherited her particular form of emotional restraint, sat still inside the embrace with the careful stillness of someone receiving something they had not known they needed. Sophia pressed her face against her mother's shoulder and stayed there. The morning light moved through the room. None of them said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said, and a great deal that was being communicated in the silence, in the warmth, in the simple and irreducible fact of the three of them occupying the same small space at the same moment in time. Elena thought about all the mornings she had left before they woke. She thought about every calculation she had made in the dark, every gap she had sealed, every shift she had worked before the sun came up. She thought about how she had carried all of it without letting it spill onto them, and how it had cost her something to do that, and how she did not regret the cost because the children in her arms were its exact and complete justification. Then Marco said, quietly, into her shoulder, "We knew something good was going to happen." She pulled back and looked at him. She said, "You didn't know? I didn't tell you." He said, "We knew because you kept going. You always keep going. That's how we knew." She did not have an answer for that. She looked at him, at this 11-year-old who had her eyes and his father's stubbornness, and something in him that was entirely his own, something she had watched form over years of close attention. And she felt the specific and irreplaceable pride of a parent who sees their child clearly and likes what they see. She said, "We're going to be okay." Marco said, "We were already okay." And Sophia said, from somewhere inside Elena's shoulder, "Now we're going to be better." In the months that followed, the process moved with the deliberate pace of official things. Documents were signed, designations were formalized, acquisitions were processed. The state exercised its right of first purchase on the manuscript documents and two of the most significant coin pieces at assessed value, which was expected and which the lawyer had prepared her for. The remainder of the settlement was structured across two payments, the first arriving in the early spring. She did not move immediately. This surprised people who heard about the situation. The assumption was that the first act would be departure, an escape from the conditions that had defined the previous years. But Elena had not come to the ruin looking for escape. She had come looking for ground. And the ground she stood on now was the same ground she had always stood on, only it had changed character. It no longer required her to fight it for every inch. What she felt in those first weeks after the settlement was not what she had expected. She had braced for disorientation, for the sudden absence of pressure to feel strange and vertiginous, the way it feels when you've been bracing against a wind that suddenly stops. Instead, what she felt was a gradual loosening, as though certain muscles she had been using for years without knowing it were finally permitted to rest. She slept differently. She ate without calculating. She sat with the children in the evenings without the background noise of arithmetic that had once run under every quiet moment. Not anxious arithmetic, not panicked, just the constant low hum of managing, of making sure the numbers held, of checking and rechecking the fragile balance of a life built on very small margins. That noise was gone now. The silence it left behind was not emptiness. It was space. She paid off the apartment's accumulated small debts first, amounts so modest that the act of paying them felt almost ceremonial, like closing doors that had been standing open for years, letting the cold in. She put money aside for the children's education in accounts that she set up with the same methodical care she had brought to everything else, not because the amounts required it, but because the habit of care was one she had no intention of abandoning simply because the circumstances that had enforced it had changed. She called Dolores and arranged for her to receive a monthly amount that Dolores initially refused and then accepted when Elena said quietly that it was not charity and it was not optional, that Dolores had made it possible for her to do what she had done, that there was a debt here even if Dolores had not meant to create one, and that Elena intended to honor it. Dolores was silent for a moment. Then she said, "You always were the practical one." Elena said, "I learned from watching you." She gave notice at the grocery store in March, not because she resented the work, but because she had made a decision about what came next that required her full attention, and full attention could not be divided. Fortunato shook her hand and said she had been one of the reliable ones, which was the highest praise in his vocabulary, and she accepted it as such. She bought the property outright, the ruin and its 4 acres, formalizing what had already been hers. She engaged an architect, not to transform the place into something it wasn't, but to understand what it had been and what, with care and proper investment, it could become again. The architect was a young woman from the nearest city who arrived for their first meeting, having already researched the historical period of the structure, and who walked the ruin with the same quality of attention Rodrigo had brought to it. Slow, specific, genuinely interested. They talked for 3 hours. By the end of it, they had the outline of a plan, a restoration that respected the original stonework, that kept the proportions and materials honest, that built function into what had survived rather than replacing it with something new. It would take time. That was fine. Elena had learned to work in time rather than against it. She enrolled in a heritage management course at the university in the city, a decision she had made quietly over the 11 weeks of waiting, sitting with the idea of what she wanted to do with what had been found, and arriving at an answer that surprised her with its clarity. The collection, or the part of it that she had retained rights to, would not simply be sold. Parts it would be. That was financially necessary and practically sensible. But the most significant pieces, the necklace, certain of the coins, the story of the chamber, and how it had been found, those had value beyond their appraised price, educational value, cultural value, the value of a story told properly to people who would otherwise never encounter it. She did not have a fully formed idea yet of what this would become. She had a direction. That was enough to begin with. Carmen came to visit in April. She drove the 3 hours herself, arrived at the property on a morning when the light was good and the new season had softened the landscape, and stood at the edge of the cleared ruin with her hands in her pockets, not saying anything for a while. Elena stood beside her and also did not say anything, because sometimes the most generous thing you can offer someone is the space to look at a thing they got wrong without having to say so again. Carmen said finally, "It's remarkable. The stone." Elena said, "I know." Carmen said, "You could see it, couldn't you? When you first came, you could see something in it." Elena considered this. She said, "I didn't see what it had. I just didn't believe it was nothing. There's a difference." Carmen looked at her. She said, "Show me where you found it." Elena led her to the section of cleared floor where the hatch was, still in place. The chamber below it, now formally documented and secured, awaiting the next stage of the heritage process. She showed Carmen the fitted stone cover, the iron ring dark against the pale stone, the careful geometry of a thing built to endure and to conceal and to wait. Carmen crouched and looked at it without touching, the way you look at something that has earned its reverence. She said, "What did it feel like when you first opened it?" Elena thought about the exhalation of cold air, the darkness below, the sound the cover had made when it finally gave. Not a crack, not a crash, but a release, the sound of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time, finally being allowed to breathe. She said, like something had been waiting a long time to be found by the right person. Carmen looked up at her. She said, "Do you think you were the right person?" Elena said, "I think I was the person who came." They stood together over the hatch for a while longer. Carmen reached out at one point and touched the iron ring with one finger, briefly, the way you touch something to confirm it is real. Then she stood and looked at her sister, and her expression had in it something Elena had not seen there in a very long time. Not just respect, which Carmen had always had for her in the complicated way older siblings have respect for younger ones, admiring what they can do while resisting what it implies about themselves, but something cleaner than that. Something more direct. The look of someone who has revised a long-held opinion and found that the revision, though uncomfortable, was worth making. Carmen said, "I'm going to come back and help with the restoration. Weekends, when I can." Elena said, "You don't have to do that." Carmen said, "I know I don't have to. That's why I'm offering." Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Bring work clothes. The kind you don't mind ruining." Carmen said, "I have clothes exactly like that. You just never knew because you never asked." The restoration began in the summer. The first phase was the outer walls, stabilizing what stood, carefully repositioning stones that had fallen in ways that allowed them to be accurately restored, addressing the foundation where centuries of weather had loosened the base courses. Elena was there every day, not supervising in the distant sense. She was present, working, learning the material by handling it, understanding the building from the inside of the process rather than from a distance. The children came on weekends and during school breaks. Marco, who had absorbed his mother's capacity for sustained focus, applied it to learning the name of every tool on the site and the purpose of every process, asking questions of the architect and the stonemasons with a seriousness they responded to by giving him real answers. Sophia brought sketchbooks and filled them. Not just the walls, but everything, the light on the stone at different hours, the shapes made by fallen pieces before they were repositioned, the faces of the workers at lunch, the caterpillar, who had been transported from Dolores's garden in a jar and installed in a sunny corner of the cleared interior, where she examined it with the satisfaction of someone who had always known this was the right place for it. Carmen came the second weekend of August, as she had promised, in clothes that were indeed exactly the kind you didn't mind ruining. She worked without complaint through 2 full days of clearing and carrying, surprising Elena with her endurance and surprising herself. Elena suspected with how much she enjoyed the physical directness of it. The way a task with stone and mortar declared itself clearly, required a specific thing, and announced when that thing was done. There was no ambiguity in it. Carmen, whose professional life was full of ambiguity, responded to its absence the way a person responds to a long-missed thing they hadn't known they were missing. On the second evening, they sat outside the storage building, Elena's office now, with food from the cooler and the late summer light going warm and long across the site. Carmen looked at the walls in that light and was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about not having the option of stopping." Elena waited. Carmen said, "I had the option. I always had the option. When things got difficult, I could stop, step back, find another way. You never had that. And I think I spent a long time being grateful for that without ever acknowledging to you that I knew what it cost." She paused. "That was wrong. I'm sorry for that too." Elena said, "I know you're sorry. I know that now." Carmen said, "Do you forgive me?" Elena considered it, not as a performance of consideration, but genuinely, because the question deserved a genuine answer. She said, "There's nothing to forgive, Carmen. You were afraid. Fear makes people small. It made you small, but you're here now, and you're bigger than you were in that phone call. That's what matters." Carmen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're unbearably decent. You know that." Elena said, "I've been told it's my most annoying quality." And Carmen laughed, a real laugh, the one that hadn't changed since they were children, that Elena had not heard in longer than she wanted to admit. And the evening settled around them, warm and unhurried, with the stone walls standing in the fading light, and the work of the day done, and the work of tomorrow waiting patiently for tomorrow. Dolores came once, in the late summer, and walked the site slowly with her hands clasped behind her back in the way she stood when she was making a serious assessment. She looked at the walls and the chamber entrance and the storage building with its repaired roof, and the young tree that had been growing inside the ruin for decades, and that the architect had designed the restoration around rather than removing. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, to no one in particular, "Well, there it is." Elena said, "There it is." Dolores said, Your great-great-uncle was a fool to let this go. Elena said, he probably didn't know what was here. Dolores said, neither did anyone else. That's the point. They stood together in the cleared center of the ruin, where the young tree's shadow moved slowly across the ground, and looked at the walls rising around them, old and scarred and full of evidence of everything they had survived and everything that had been done to preserve them through the long centuries of their patience. The news of the find had spread, as news spreads, gradually and then all at once. There had been a piece in a regional newspaper in the spring, careful, factual, written by a journalist who had clearly taken care with her sources. There had been a follow-up in a national publication, longer, more detailed, focused less on the numbers than on the story. A woman alone on a property everyone had dismissed, working through the debris of 3 centuries to find what no one else had believed was there. The response to both pieces had surprised Elena with its quality. Not prurient interest in the money, though that was there too, but something else, letters and messages from people she had never met, from women in circumstances she recognized, from people who had been told their inheritance was nothing, who had been advised to let go of things others considered worthless, who had held on anyway, or who wished they had. She answered as many of them as she could, briefly, honestly, without turning the experience into a lesson or a performance. She did not have a philosophy to offer. She had a story, and the story was this. She had not known what was there. She had only refused to accept that nothing was there. The distance between those two positions was where everything had happened. Among the messages that reached her was one that she returned to more than once over the following weeks. It was from a woman in the north of the country, older, who wrote in the careful, formal style of someone for whom letter writing was a considered act. She said that she had read the article about Elena 3 times. She said that she had a piece of land she had inherited from her grandmother, a steep and rocky hillside that everyone had always told her was worthless, that she had been paying a small annual tax on for 30 years without ever visiting it, because visiting it would have meant confronting the fact that everyone was probably right. She said she had decided, after reading about Elena, to go and look. She said she did not expect to find anything, but she was going to go and look. Elena wrote back. She said, good, go and look. That's all it takes. Go and look with your own eyes, not through other people's assumptions. Most of what we dismiss as worthless has not been examined. It has only been judged. She never heard back from the woman. She did not know what was on the hillside. She did not know if anything was found, or if the woman went and found exactly what everyone had told her was there. Nothing. In return, confirmed in the old dismissal. It was possible. Not everything concealed something. Not every ruin held a chamber. The lesson was not that persistence always yielded treasure. The lesson was that you could not know what you had until you looked directly at it, honestly, with your own hands and your own time and your own willingness to be wrong in either direction. Pilar visited in the autumn, when the first phase of restoration was almost complete and the walls were solid enough that you could walk the perimeter without caution, running your hand along the stone the way you run your hand along the spine of a book you've been meaning to read for a long time and have finally opened. Pilar walked the whole perimeter without speaking, and then she stood in the center of the cleared interior under the open sky, with the young tree beside her and the old stone around her and the late-season light coming through at the angle that made everything look like it had been placed exactly where it was on purpose. And she said, "This is yours." Elena said, "Yes." Pilar said, "You built it." Elena said, "I uncovered it." "There's a difference." Pilar said, "No, there isn't. Not really. Not for you." Elena thought about that for a while. She thought about the first morning at the site, the drive in the dark, the early light on the stone. She thought about the feel of the debris between her fingers in the days before she found the shape. She thought about the iron ring, cold against her palm, the resistance, the breath before the pull. She thought about the cold air that had risen from the dark, carrying the smell of 300 years of waiting. She thought about the word rubble. She thought about what the word meant and what it assumed, that the value of a thing was visible on its surface, that what could not be seen from a distance was not there, that what others had discarded must have been correctly discarded, that the judgment of people standing outside a thing was more reliable than the understanding of the person willing to go inside it. She thought about her children, about the life they would have now. Not a perfect life, not a life without difficulty, because difficulty was part of life, and she had no interest in protecting them from the kind that built something in you rather than taking something away. But a life with options. A life where the calculations that had occupied her every waking hour for years became, gradually, a language she no longer needed to speak with such exhausting fluency. A life where Marco could study what he was interested in, and Sophia could sketch what she saw, and Elena herself could stand in the restored ruin of something 300 years old and understand that her work on it was not finished, but that it was real and solid and hers. She thought about her great-great-uncle Teodoro, whom she had never met, who had let the property pass in a silence and distance, and eventually into a letter in a parking lot. She did not judge him for it. Whatever had led him away from this place, whatever had made him leave it to become the family's unspoken inheritance, the thing no one wanted, the land that cost nothing because it was considered to be nothing, she could not know. She knew only that the silence he had left it and had preserved something it might not otherwise have survived, that the distance between him and the property had kept certain hand away from it, that 300 years of being considered worthless had been, in the end, the thing that kept it whole. In the spring of the following year, she stood at the entrance of the restored storage building. Her office now, its walls straight and its roof solid, and its shelves holding books and documents rather than old bottles and rusted tools, and looked across the site at the main ruin, whose walls stood clean and stable in the morning light, whose chamber was being formally prepared for a heritage interpretation project she was developing with Dr. Carvalho and the university, whose stones had been placed by hands 300 years dead and would stand for 300 more if they were properly tended. Marco was with her. He had asked to come for the weekend, specifically, he said, because he wanted to see the first phase of the main structure completed. He stood beside her with his hand in his pockets the way she stood when she was making a serious assessment, which she recognized as a thing he had learned from watching her, the way children learn things from watching without being taught. He said, "Do you think there's more? Down there?" She said, "The chamber has been fully documented. We know what's in it." He said, "I mean in general, in the walls, under the ground, more things that nobody found yet." She looked at the site, at the walls, at the section of the interior where the young tree grew from the earth, its roots working through the stone with patient vegetable persistence, holding things together that would otherwise have slid apart. At the entrance arch, still standing after 3 centuries, 2 great stones upright with a third resting across them at an angle, held there by nothing more than the precision of its own weight. She said, "Probably." He said, "Are you going to look?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." They stood together in the morning light, mother and son, in the entrance of a place that had been called worthless by everyone who had looked at it from the outside and never gone in, and they looked at the work that remained, and it was considerable, and it was good, and it was theirs. Somewhere below the floor of the ruin, 300 years of patience had already given everything it had been keeping. And somewhere in the walls, and the earth, and the long, quiet history of the place, there might be more of the same, or something entirely different, or nothing at all, which was also possible and also fine, because the point had never been the finding. The point had been the refusal to walk away from a thing that everyone else had already left behind. Elena put her hand on the stone of the arch, cold and old and solid. The same stone she had touched on that first morning when the light was low and the property was new to her, and she had not yet known what was inside it. She kept her hand there for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the 3 centuries of weather it had endured, the hands that had placed it there, long dead, who had worked with the same patient intention she had brought to the clearing and the cleaning and the waiting. There was a continuity in the stone that she had not expected to feel and now could not imagine having missed. The sense that care, applied to a thing over time, left a trace that did not fully disappear. That the original builders were still present in what they had built, still legible in the precision of the cut and the sureness of the placement. The way a person's character is legible in the work they leave behind long after they are gone. She thought about what she would leave behind. Not in the grand sense. She had no illusions about legacy or permanence, but in the specific sense. What would the restoration show about her when it was complete? What would be readable in the choices she made about what to preserve and what to replace, about which stones to reposition and which to leave where they had fallen, about the young tree she had kept and the art she had kept, and the chamber she had turned into a place of learning rather than a secret. She hoped it would show care. She hoped it would show honesty. She hoped it would show, in whatever small and material way stone and mortar could show such a thing, that someone had stood here and taken the place seriously, that someone had looked at it without looking away. She took her hand from the stone and went inside. Marco followed. The work continued. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.